Hello, so I want to talk about crime and specifically homicide rates, but also the perception of crime, causes of crime, and so on. I'm looking at this on a global context, so bear with me. This is by no means going to be a very, very comprehensive video because it would be simply impossible to do a very deeply comprehensive video on a world scale. It would be, that would take up a million hours of camera work. But I got this the other day. Um, Don't know if that can clearly be seen or not. It says on the brink, Brazil has over 55 homicides a year, excuse me, 55,000 homicides a year, and 22 of the world's 50 most dangerous cities. So this is actually from the Scientologists, which, by the way, I don't subscribe to. They were just handing this out and it caught my attention. Of course, they're arguing Scientology will cure that. If you're a Scientologist, you're going to believe that, but I'm skeptical. Anyway, quite a graphic image there of the sort of paramilitary police, presumably going into a favela. Crime in Brazil has been a hot topic leading up to the Rio de Janeiro Olympics, and it became topical with the release of the film City of God, Cidade de Deus, I believe is in Portuguese, which was a notorious Rio slum, and there was a sequel to that film, City of Men. City of God won a lot of awards as a film, and it brought a lot of attention to this issue. So I thought I'd do a little bit of research on the Wikipedia page. Now, I know people are skeptical of Wikipedia as a source, but the problem is there is no single source for world homicide rates. There is no single reliable source that can be absolutely concrete. So with that in mind, I think this Wikipedia source is as good as any. I mean, the UN doesn't even have a single tracking method of looking at homicide rates country by country, nor does the CIA World Factbook, because all they can rely on is the data from governments, and governments don't always collect all the data. Different governments use different approaches, and some governments are quite restrictive in what information they release. For example, more authoritarian governments. So I'm just going to talk about some of the rates here. I'm going to focus primarily on Brazil because that is what I've been discussing here, but I'm obviously going to look at other countries as well and other territories. So the Wikipedia page lists homicide rate per 100,000 people. That is to say, the number of people who are killed per 100,000. I believe that is the methodology in which they're using. And they also put the total figures. Total figures, of course, have to be taken into context as to how many people a country has. So let's start with Brazil. They have a rate of 24.6, and this is to the nearest year available, which is 2014. And the total homicide rate, or the total homicide figure that year, I should say, was 50,674. Now, that's a very large figure, but you have to also bear in mind Brazil is the world's fifth most populous country. Um, Now, there's a lot made about crime rates in Brazil, but actually, in world terms, it ranks 15th. There are 14 countries and territories that are above Brazil, and all of them virtually are Central American countries and territories, with one exception, which is Lesotho. Um, so, just to look at some other rates, in fact, the highest rate in the world by the nearest figure, the nearest annual figure, was Honduras. Honduras has an appalling crime rate, violent crime rate, 84.6% per 100,000 people, not percent, sorry, 84.6 per 100,000. That is staggering. Total homicide figure of 5,936, and this is in a country of less than 10 million people. Can't remember what the population of Honduras is, but it's not a big country. 5,936. To put that into context, that is more people than many armed conflicts in the world combined. For example, to put that into context, the armed conflict between Turkey and the PKK over the last year has cost around 2,500 lives. The war in Somalia over the last year has been about 2,000 lives. So combined, Honduras has an annual homicide rate that is higher than many war zones. Venezuela is very high, 62.0%. should stop, excuse me, not percent, that's per 100,000 people. 19,030 people were killed in Venezuela in the year 2014. Among US territories, the US Virgin Islands is very high, 52.6. I'm not sure what the figure for that is, but actually, there is one other country outside the Americas that is higher than Brazil, that is South Africa, 33.0, a total of 17,805 homicides, and I believe that was for 2013 or 2014. South Africa is another country that has a reputation for violent crime, but like I say, Lesotho has even higher rates than South Africa. Lesotho is a very small country. They had 764 homicides in the year 2010. To put that into context, that is higher than the UK, despite having a population that is much, much less. That is 38.0 per 100,000. Now, within Brazil, there's some interesting figures. There is a big inconsistency among Brazilian states. The highest homicide rate is Alagoas State, 64.6 per 100,000. The major city there is Maceió, or Maceió, I'm not sure how that's pronounced in Portuguese. Interesting, the Rio de Janeiro state and Sao Paulo state, despite all the attention they get as the major urban centres of Brazil, actually are on the lower side of things among Brazilian states. Both states have also seen significant decreases in violent crime. In Rio de Janeiro state, this is the whole state, not just the city, 28.3. Sao Paulo is significantly safer, 15.1. Um, and yet both cities have, around the world, they have a reputation for being very violent. I think everything is depending on context. Now, if you're comparing Sao Paulo to Dusseldorf or Stockholm, then yes, it's still a very violent and dangerous city. But if you're comparing Sao Paulo to Tegucigalpa in Honduras, then it's relatively safe. Um, Big American cities, if Donald Trump is to be believed, have got more dangerous over the last year. I think again with American states, it's a huge country. I mean, with America, so there's great fluctuation from state to state, from city to city. I think it is fair to say the average American city has higher homicide rates than the average European city. The United States overall is significantly less than a lot of the countries I've already named. However, it is significantly higher than some European countries. The actual US figure um, in 2012 was 5.0, 15,547 homicides. Now, that's significantly less than Brazil, which has a smaller population. Um, so the US still remains a much safer country than Brazil. However, compared to France, 1.2, the UK, 0.9, there was a total of 602 homicides in this country. Now, I'm wondering, is that just England and Wales or the whole United Kingdom? Because within this country, we actually have a different legal system and police figures for England and Wales versus Scotland and Northern Ireland. So if it is 602 in total, that is certainly, I know within British context, that is a decrease in previous years where we've had over 1,000 homicides per year. The UK has never been an exceptionally high country in terms of homicide. I think you would find we have a much higher crime rate in terms of common assault and those sort of crimes, and drunken thuggery, people being vandalism, those sort of crimes I think are higher in the UK. Homicide rates relatively low. Germany is the same as the UK, 0.9. They had a total of 716 homicides to the year nearest figure available. But bear in mind, Germany has 81 million people. China is very low, 0.8 per 100,000. If you look at the total homicide rate in China, 11,286, that would seem very high, but bear in mind, China is the world's most populous country, so it is relatively low. Um, but like I say, we need to be slightly wary of some of the figures that come from countries that are quite secretive about their data. An interesting phenomenon is you would expect Middle Eastern countries to be very high because Middle Eastern countries are always in the news for war. Um, Very often, when a country is facing instability because of war, data is not available. It's the functioning state of the government. Governments are trying to survive, never mind taking figures available for data. And that's why very often in these sort of surveys, Some countries aren't even registered, that you can't even get available figures. Iraq, the figure was 8.0, 2,628 homicides in 2012. In world terms, that is actually slightly below the middle. In other words, Iraq is significantly safer than Honduras. And yet we think of Iraq, we think of a war zone. Honduras is not a political war zone. So that's an interesting phenomenon that very often the homicide rates in some countries is so high, they actually have more deaths, violent deaths, than certain war zones. Um, but very often, I think a big problem here is within a war zone, how do you tell the difference between um, deaths from the political conflict versus deaths from, say, a violent mugging that has gone wrong? And is it accurate? Is it appropriate to include exacerbated crime rates from instability? That has been the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq in other years has the crime rate in Baghdad significantly increased, with the state of war. So is it accurate to include, say, for example, you have a breakdown in law and order because of the political situation? Should therefore, let's say you have a situation where someone is mugged, violently killed in a mugging in Kinshasa or Baghdad, should they be included as part of the conflict in those countries or as part of the general crime rate? That's where it gets murky. And one of the most prominent examples of that is Mexico. I think I've got the figure for Mexico here, yes. 15.7, 19,669 homicides in 2013. Now, are those homicides regular crime homicides, i.e., you know, robberies gone wrong, rape victims being killed? And that's not to trivialize them, by the way, but is that the same as the drug cartels? The thing about Mexico, it's quite hard to determine because Mexico is also listed as an armed conflict. It's called the Mexico Drug War. And yet Mexico probably has a homicide rate smaller, lower, I should say, than Venezuela or Honduras, which are not classed as armed conflicts. So with Mexico, it's very difficult to evaluate, is that a war zone, or is it just a country with the standard situation of having high crime rates, which is consistent with most Latin American countries? There are a few exceptions. Belize is safer, Costa Rica is safer, but generally, if you look at the world situation, where there is most violent crime rates, they tend to be in South America, Central America, and parts of Africa, whereas North America, Europe, and a good bit of Asia is relatively safer. So I find it interesting to evaluate all of this. Um, Again, with Russia, if Russia's classed as a European country, at least the urbanized part of Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, is within the European part of Russia, 9.5, 13,681 homicides. So that's significantly higher than the United States and significantly higher than Western European countries. So if we class Russia as a European country, then Russia's significantly higher than many other European countries. Okay, so that's the first part of the video, the crime rates. I think it is something that really is not an exact science. Everyone's focusing on violent crime in Brazil, but it has to be taken in context that actually violent crime, I think it has shocked the rest of the world because of, we're focusing on Brazil because, excuse me, because of the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. And there has been a few notable incidents. I believe there were two spectators murdered on the opening day, and Ryan Lochte, the American Olympian, and some of his teammates were robbed at gunpoint. There was also a Belgian athlete who reported his experience, and the British athlete Greg Rutherford, the long jumper, had his phone stolen with his pictures of his young son. I suppose what many athletes would say is it's better to be robbed than to be killed, but it's still an unpleasant experience. Um, and that kind of brings me to the second part of the video now. In the film City of God, the picture that is presented is that this is a hellhole slum, and the crime comes about from circumstance, from poverty. But if we look at crime in Brazil as being down to poverty, why is it then, if we use hardship and poverty as an explanation for high crime, why is it you don't get hundreds of Syrian refugees resorting to crime in Europe? It is true that there has been crime committed by migrants, but they have been more of a North African descent. For example, the situation in Cologne in Germany. Um, I don't think it's as simple as simply saying hardship equals people resorting to crime. In a sense, it's almost slandering people who are poor. It's like saying if you're poor, you're going to be a criminal. I accept that if you grow up in a certain environment, if you're growing up in a favela where there is rampant crime, where there's problems with electricity, where there's violent gang culture, and it is deeply entrenched from the day that you're born, it is very, very difficult to escape that lifestyle. But even looking in more developed countries, when we look at crime in London and in the United States, I read today, for example, about a young black man who was horribly murdered in South London in Croydon. Apparently, he was slashed to death with machetes. Now, this is Britain I'm talking about, which is like I said in the statistics, relatively safe country. So this is obviously shocking, but according to the report, he was a ambitious rapper, but he had tried very hard to get out of the estate. Now that says to me that he knew that if he stayed there, there was a chance that he was going to end up in gangs, and it's a tragedy that this young man has been brutally murdered. Um, Another example is I forget the actor's name, but one of the actors in the new Star Wars movie that played one of the stormtroopers. I don't know the character name because I didn't see the film. But he grew up in the same estate that Damalola Taylor was murdered in. Damalola Taylor was a young Nigerian boy. His murder shocked Britain back in 2000, where a youth gang basically killed him and they put something down his throat to stop him breathing. That really impacted his father, and it became a very high profile case because of the problem of youth gangs in London. London has obviously much higher violent crime rates than other British cities, but naturally, statistically, that wouldn't be the case. London, to put things in context, London has an average of about 100 homicides a year, but that's a city of 8.5 million. So comparing that, for example, to certain American cities, St. Louis, Missouri, which is much, much smaller than London, has a much higher homicide rate. Chicago is smaller than London, it has a higher homicide rate. But within North America, there has been significant decreases in. So I'm not sure how accurate Trump's claim was. Part of the problem is it's inconsistent. I mean, a few years ago, New York City had significantly decreased from its 1990 peak. I believe in the year 1990, New York City had, and sorry, I'm going back to statistics here, but obviously it's connected to the video matter. New York City had, I believe, 2,200 plus murders. That was coming in the wake of the crack cocaine epidemic. Um, in more recent years, it's been more like 500. I'm rounding off here. So New York City, whether that was Giuliani's broken window policy, I should say Bill Bratton's broken window policy, um, it's hard to tell, but New York City became one of the safest big cities in North America. So there's all sorts of angles that you could look at. I personally have some issue with kind of using poverty or hardship as an excuse. Um, that's not to say that it isn't an issue. I remember talking to a South African girl about this, and she said she couldn't understand violent crime in Britain because in South Africa they at least had an excuse because they were dirt poor. And that kind of got me thinking, well, I mean, it does piss me right off. I'm socially conservative on crime issues. It pisses me off in the British context when um, social workers and so on kind of gave the narrative that society should somehow feel sorry for people who terrorize it. I have zero sympathy for gangs who attack individuals and make people's lives a misery. And I really don't think this is a class issue because, for one thing, some of the main victims of gangs are people who are from a more working class background, put it that way if I can. Um, so there's many, many areas to look at. But anyway, I'm going to round this up. I want to make an open question to Brazilians. How do you feel about the situation in Brazil? Do you feel that crime is a very big problem? Do you think the international community misjudges Brazil? Um, do you personally feel safe? And please let me know which city you're from because I'm interested in that. There is a big discrepancy state to state. Are you from Rio de Janeiro? Are you from Sao Paulo? Are you from Belo Horizonte, Salvador? If you're Brazilian, please let me know which city you're from or which state. And how do you personally feel? I know there are many Brazilians feel Rousseff done far too little on violent crime, so I'm not sure if the situation has now got worse again, bearing in mind those statistics I mentioned are from 2013, 2014, so that's already 2 or 3 years ago. Um, but certainly the situation in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, if the statistics are to be believed on Wikipedia, they have significantly decreased. The late 90s, the figures were much, much higher in those states. So I'm interested in hear what Brazilians have to say about this. And incidentally, with this video, I'm not intending to offend any country. I'm not, this is not a competition. Crime is a plague all over the world. And my heart goes out to all victims of crime, wherever they are. I have been a victim of crime myself. I had to leave my home because of gangs. It's a very, very unpleasant experience. And, people in the situation of Brazil, when street kids hold up athletes at gunpoint, that to me is shocking. I heard even Pele, the great footballer, was once held up at gunpoint. Seems to me to be a chronic situation. But like I say, maybe it has improved. Brazil is certainly not as bad as Honduras or some other Central American countries. Um, okay, so let me know your thoughts. I have spoken for a while here, but it is important if you're Brazilian, especially, I mean, obviously anyone's free to comment, but I'm particularly interested in hearing from Brazilians. Do you think the government's crime policies are hard enough? Do you think there's a big problem, and this is something I didn't mention, with paramilitary police? Because this has been an issue in Brazil, certainly from an outside perspective. There has been a lot of concern about the police killing Brazilian civilians. Brazil has obviously made a transition to democracy, but there are reports about thousands of Brazilian civilians dying at the hands of police, many of them even children. Do you think that's a problem? I guess this all depends on whether you're coming from the left or the right or the center. If I was a Brazilian, and this is, easy for me to say, I would want a situation where people felt safe, where the security situation improved, and where certain types of crime were punished. But I would also want a situation where the police weren't militarized to the point where they were killing civilians. And the situation in Brazil seems to be that they are, we talk about American police being militarized, but in Brazil, I mean, just look at that picture. You'd think it was a war zone. And from what I understand, certain parts of Brazilian cities really do feel like a war zone. You have helicopters going overhead, you have paramilitary police, you have very high homicide rates. Certainly, Honduras must feel like Syria at times. Um, so, anyway, I've covered a lot of issues there. Let me know your thoughts. And once again, my intention with this is not to offend anybody. I'm just interested in hearing international views on this. Let me know what country you're from, and I don't want to hear what so much about what the statistics of your country is, but how you personally feel. Because sometimes the perception of crime, how people feel, isn't in tandem with what the official figures are. And obviously, here I'm talking about homicide rates, but feel free to mention other crimes, rape, um, violent gang activity. Some types of crime are higher than some countries than others. It's obviously a huge global problem. Um, Let me know your thoughts. Let me know which country you're from, how you personally feel in your city. And for my part, in my city, I live in Sunderland in northeast England. According to the Home Office, we have relatively low crime figures. I have experienced crime in this city. I'm not going to go into very great detail, but simply because the time doesn't permit it. But overall, I feel relatively safe in the UK. I would say, though, actually, I had an interesting discussion with my Chinese friend. She runs an English forum, We were discussing this, me, Chinese people, and an Indian guy. Um, but like I say, perception of crime is another thing. Personally, I feel pretty safe in the UK, but I do think we have a problem with yob culture. That is to say, drunk idiots, not always drunk even, insulting passers-by, sometimes wanting to start a fight for no reason. And I think assault is a big problem. And I do think in cities like London, there are still far too many knife thugs around. And there is still a big problem of gang culture. Maybe not compared to other countries, but still a problem nonetheless in cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, and Liverpool. So, yeah, I really have spoken too long now. But anyway, please let me know your thoughts, perception, where you're from, your city, all of that. Thanks for watching.